Hi, it's Alison and Lee from the Law School Toolbox. Today, we're looking to the future and talking about how AI might reshape legal education and practice. All right, everybody. Well, if you have been under a rock for the last several years, maybe you haven't heard of Gen AI, but everybody else is probably familiar with ChatGPT, Claude, DeepSeek, all these tools that are definitely going to be influencing the legal profession. So today, we want to talk a little bit about that, about how you might see them in legal education, how that might be helpful for you, particularly if maybe you have ADHD or something like that, and also talk a little bit about legal practice and what you might be seeing in the workplace. So, Lee, I don't know. What do you think? Is AI going to transform everything?
Well, I was pretty scared of AI. You were talking about it pretty early on, and I was definitely someone who was like, I am not touching this chat GPT nonsense. I was very much not into it. And I'm a full convert. Some of it's still very intimidating, and maybe the computers will take over the world, but I am starting to see the ways that it can benefit us. Like we use it in our professional life. I'm seeing how students are using it. And I think it's very interesting what it has the capacity to do in the legal profession. So I'm excited to be talking about this. But if anyone is still a little freaked out by AI, I get it because I was there maybe a year ago, but I think I had logged into nothing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I was like, have you never used Claude? We should really, I'll show you Claude. And you were like, I don't know. And then within about 30 minutes, you're like, wow, this is actually really
I know.
helpful.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things, like, obviously, I mean, it's not going to replace legal reasoning. It's
No.
not going to replace studying. I think sometimes people have the idea that, oh, you can just, outsource all of your case reading and briefing to an AI. And it's like, well, that's not really the point of law school. But I do think for sure, I think we're at the very beginning stages of really a research revolution
Mhm.
in legal research. So if that's not something that people have come across yet in school, I think that's something you want to be aware of. I also think that, AI has a lot of options that can help you with your study materials, like generating practice questions, multiple choice, that kind of thing. So I think it's interesting to kind of think through, what is even the role of a lawyer or the role of law school in this kind of changing time frame. And I don't think it's necessarily a huge shift, but I think there are ways you can probably be efficient as a student.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things too is as this technology is changing so fast, sometimes it can seem incredibly powerful. And then I'm always surprised when it does something completely wrong.
Right. Where you're like, huh, that seems pretty
Yeah,
obvious.
because the thing about the generative AI is it's confidently wrong. It will provide you quotes that are wrong. It will provide you law that is wrong. It is just able to be wrong and doesn't know that it's wrong or doesn't tell you that it's wrong. And so I think that, as we think about how it is going to benefit students and the legal profession, I still find it interesting where we find its limitations
Yeah.
and where it becomes a powerful tool. And so, if you are listening to this and you're thinking, I have also not logged into one of these generative AI apps or websites, I get that. But when you do start interacting with it, just remember that it is a bit of a flawed system.
Right. And I think that's across the board. I've definitely had it generate some questions and answers in a legal context where, it just confused the defendant and the plaintiff or something
Hmm.
like that. I was studying for a different type of exam and I asked it for some stuff and it just confidently made some things up.
Yeah.
And I told it was wrong and it said, oh, sorry, you're right, I'm wrong. And then it confidently made up something totally different that was also totally wrong. So
Hmm.
I think some of this is just understanding this is not like a magic thing that you can just
Hmm.
put stuff into. I think it's great at things like summarizing or giving things in a different tone. If you have something really lengthy that you're interested in, just kind of getting a bullet point summary of things like that. Totally amazing.
Yeah.
But, if you ask it to actually draft your legal writing memo, A, probably not
Not
ethically
ethical.
appropriate. And B, also probably not going to work all that well.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting to use it to look for inconsistencies. I think that is one way that I have used it. I have fed it long documents and said, please find anything that seems inconsistent. And it can quickly find things like that. Somebody mentions that they'll follow up with something later and they never do. well, the AI can catch that, whereas a human might catch that if you're reading pretty carefully, but you may or may not catch that. I
Right.
think that's powerful. It can find patterns, like you said, it can summarize. So, I think that when I think about it in the legal context, to me, I think, well, we know that it can't be a lawyer yet.
Right.
So even we know it can't be a doctor, right? Even though they're having some interesting use cases of it being able to compare a lot of data, right? I think we've talked about using AI to do breast cancer screening and the accuracy because it can just look at all sorts of data really quickly and identify things that maybe humans wouldn't necessarily identify. Like it's fascinating stuff, but it's still not a doctor that can like interact with
Right.
you. And I think of the legal context in the same thing. It may be able to cut out some of the busy work that lawyers do, but in the end, at least yet, it is not a lawyer.
Right. And I do think it's, potentially useful for brainstorming ideas and things like that. But ultimately, as an attorney or as someone who is aspiring to be an attorney, you are still employing your judgment as a person to decide, like, is that a good idea? Does that make sense? Like, would this be a good argument to make? Not just kind of
Mhm.
blindly following what, kind of what this machine spits back to you and says, oh, yeah, this very confidently, this is the correct answer.
Yeah. But I think it is interesting. We talked about brainstorming, how it can, you can have kind of an ongoing iterative discussion with the AI. We do this with Claude. Claude is one of our favorites. And, I was asking for some brainstorming on something, and you can continue to ask it to drill down, and then you will find its limits. But
Yeah.
sometimes you can get some, good content out of there, but you will say, oh, or this is getting repetitive. I think because it's so confident, you sometimes forget until you dive into it that some of it is wrong or repetitive or it's just making things up.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think one of the things we've been kind of looking at and exploring is how some of these tools or concepts even can be interesting for students who might have ADHD. So a lot of the students we work with have ADHD, a lot of students in law school have ADHD. And this comes with particular challenges around executive functioning, like organization, planning. And I've seen some really interesting and pretty powerful tools in this context where it'll help you sort of break down the steps of something.
Hmm.
And I feel like that could be really useful for someone who's feeling overwhelmed. Maybe you're facing, an open universe memo that you're drafting and you're just not really sure, like, kind of how to get started on it. So I've seen some interesting stuff there.
Yeah. Because I follow Instagram folks who talk about this stuff because that's how cool I am. Like that's what's on my Instagram feed. But in case you were wondering. But I was reading something on Instagram where they were talking about this too, really focusing on like using AI to help you make a to-do list, a task list, and even help you prioritize to say, here's my to-do list. How would you recommend that I prioritize? Like these kind of fundamental things that can be roadblocks to folks with ADHD. How can I, schedule my 8 hours of work time today with breaks? What are optimal time for these tasks? I think that, you know, for folks with ADHD for whom the planning is the stumbling block, it can just give you a plan to start with and then you're editing something. Um, so I do think that that can be really helpful. Although I think there is the risk that you go down a rabbit hole and you spend a ton of time messing with the AI to perfect a schedule when you could have spent 20 minutes doing some other task. I think that that does, like most things, there can be another side to it. But, it can help you make a study schedule. It could help you suggest a calendar. It could break down complex assignments. It could, give you suggestions on how to set deadlines for yourself. I mean, it is a different kind of a taskmaster, but I think you have to understand what it's doing when you ask it those questions because I think sometimes it's not like they're going to give you the ideal schedule. There's that other thing going around on social media. It's like ask ChatGPT for the most productive day for someone who wants to be a CEO. Have you seen this stuff? It's like ask it.
No.
Oh, well, see, your Instagram feed is different than mine. But there people will say like, just tell me what I have to do every day to get to some goal and it will just give you something. And people are
Right.
like, wow. I'm like, well, yeah, that's cool. So I went on and I was like, tell me how to pass the bar. And it had some like okay suggestions, but it wasn't like life changing, But I think
Right.
sometimes people just need something to start with. And I think that's the idea of just saying, like, if you want this to be a catalyst to you actually doing the work, then I think that that can be really helpful.
Right. I think sometimes it's just that white page, blank page problem of like,
Yeah.
okay, I have all this stuff to do. I don't really know where to get started on it.
Yeah.
You can have an endless conversation with Claude or ChatGPT or your favorite AI
Hmm.
about, how you should structure your day. But again, I do think also, like you said, you want to make sure you're not spending all of your time chatting with your new virtual friend versus like actually doing the
No,
work.
it's so true.
Yeah, but I can see, if I'm imagining like if I need to find a note topic or something, like it could help me brainstorm that. And maybe if I have a bunch of articles, potentially summarize some of them for me. I mean, at some point, if they become relevant, you're probably going to actually need to read them yourself. But, I think we've all like saved a bunch of cases or printed out a bunch of stuff and then found out 80% of it was basically irrelevant and was a total like waste of time. So, you could probably get through some of that faster. If you had some of these tools working for you.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think you could also now use some of the tools within the tools. Like, for instance, Claude has the ability to create projects where you can feed it a lot of material and create a project. So if I was brainstorming a note, and let's say I was going to write the note on, well, I'll just do what I wrote my note that didn't get published on. So physician assisted suicide for Alzheimer's patients. That was my very light topic that I didn't ended up not publishing. But so if that's my topic, right, you have all of this stuff and you could give it, 30 articles or whatever and say, like, I'm looking for, some themes, or what are some open questions, or what are people talking about the future? And I think it could go through that data set and help you brainstorm from that. I think that could be really powerful. I remember looking for paper and note topics, and sometimes it was really a frustrating thing where you're just trying to find circuit splits or you're trying to find somewhere that there's some space. And I think that you could use these tools pretty effectively to, to look for those patterns or look for those holes that maybe sometimes are hard to find on your own.
No, I think that's right. And somebody might be listening to this saying like, oh, well, that sounds kind of like cheating. I mean, obviously you want to find out what, your professor is comfortable with you doing. But I do think that sort of thing is actually really useful when you think about how are these tools going to be used in practice. Because
Hmm.
the reality is, lawyers are expensive. They typically bill by the hour. And clients don't necessarily want to pay as much as they're paying, for certain qualities of work. So I think in practice, if you're thinking, oh, well, how are these going to be used? I think as a law student, you need to be kind of understanding this is what I might be expected to do. So, I mean, things like I can't imagine. I mean, I would be kind of shocked if, the average first year is now still drafting like discovery responses. That to me seems like something that if firms are not having an AI assistant do with them, again, obviously somebody has to look at it, but like, I mean, I remember drafting discovery responses. They just were like, here's our standard template of responses to these standard questions. And like, maybe out of 50 requests, there would be like 2 that we needed to really think about. I mean, it was
Yeah.
pretty rote.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember that, like, firms have been using kind of generative software for a while for
Yeah.
things in like wills and trusts, and I bet in family law. Like, there are just some programs that have been out there for a while that I think AI may like make it faster and easier to use. But I do think that, you know, for law students, you don't always have a lot of visibility into what's happening in the workplace. And, I mean, dis- discovery responses. You're not seeing that in law school.
No.
All of
No,
that,
I mean,
right? Motions in limine, like all of that stuff. It wasn't until I got to my desk and they're like, do this. You're like, I don't know what that is.
right. Like, I'm sorry, how do I respond to
Right. You're
these?
like,
You know? And they're like, "Oh, here's the document, the template that shows you how to respond
right.
to these."
Cool. And you're like, thanks, thanks.
You're like,
So
"Great, yeah."
yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
are there going to be systems in place that are going to make that easier? And some of them going to be AI powered? Like, of course. But I think that it may not in practice feel like as far away as what some attorneys are doing now, because there has been a lot of streamlining. There's been streamlining around document review. There's
Yeah.
been a lot of stuff has changed over the last decade plus. And firms are using technology to be more efficient. Even when you think about like AI note takers, I think that that's
Hmm.
something else that we're seeing in legal meetings, which is, creating documentation. It's speeding up the ability of probably paralegals and other assistants to, follow up with folks and keep records. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that everyone's adopting really fast. But I think that's partly because it's just not that different from some of the stuff that they were already doing.
Right. I mean, you can imagine like a stenographer sitting in court, I mean, or in a meeting that's been going on for generations. It's just now an AI is taking the notes for you and
Hmm.
summarizing them really fast.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting things going on around like case strategy and analysis. And this again, some of this has been going on for a while. I mean, I can remember 10 or 15 years ago, there were people who were starting to look at, how judges were behaving around very granular types of things. So, did they tend to like grant certain types of motions or something, not just like, oh, how was the case decided, but like on a pretty granular level. And I think
Hmm.
that has increased a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and just kind of in this analysis piece of if you can look at the entire universe of stuff, maybe you can, get a better sense of like what you're really dealing with. So I think, a lot of this is pretty on the cutting edge still. But I think there are a lot of things around that that just give people sort of more visibility into more data. You could argue whether this is like a good or a bad thing or like useful or not useful, but I think it kind of is what it is.
And I think if you think about, commercial litigation, which both you and I did, you know, back in the day, the idea is that you could just, drown someone in paperwork, right? You could
Yeah.
drown somebody in documents. It would take, I mean, I'm sure you sat in rooms where you were all supposed to go through documents as fast as you could. I mean, there was a lot of that manpower. And now, if you're looking, if you're just looking for certain things, like computers are going to be able to do that for you at a much more
Yeah.
efficient pace than lawyers will do it, and also much cheaper. And so, I think also it's going to lighten this load of like how we litigate, because just burying people in paperwork isn't going to quite work the same anymore. You think about movies and TV shows where they start, unloading the boxes of discovery, like here it comes, and then they're like, no, the corporation is filling our small practice with all these boxes and we're never going to be able to you know, get through it. And now like the machine's going to do it, right? It's going to be different.
Right, and I think that's a potential leveler too. If people are thinking like, well, I don't really either want big law or big law is not feasible for me. It's like, well, if you learn how to use these tools or even like develop some of your own or whatnot, like you can actually compete on a more level playing field with people who are not moving so quickly. And the same thing with like the research tools that are coming on board. Like, we've talked to Paxton AI, but super interesting stuff. And a lot of it, as a law student, you can just get exposure to and kind of play with and see what it does. And they're moving so quickly that
Hmm.
even in a couple of years, I mean, they'll be far more advanced than they are now. But I think the more you can do as a student to kind of get exposure to that, probably the better.
Yeah. I also think around client management, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of project management systems that have come out kind of in this new AI realm. But I mean, you think about like client management systems. I mean, for those who haven't really thought about it, when you have a bunch of clients, like you have all this information, you're required to keep all this information. You have to like
Got like
you
conflicts,
got
all the stuff.
conflicts, client trust accounts and money, and you also have like intakes, and you have all these different people communicating with the client. And how are you going to track all of that stuff? It's not just in your email. And AI is going to not only help with that, but probably prompt follow-ups if you haven't heard from someone. I think that, folks we know that have been using some of this AI powered project management software, that's a lot of what they appreciate, is that the software says, it's been, 6 weeks since you talked to so and so. Have you reached out again? Like, this is, or it automatically sends the email to just say, like,
Right.
it's time to set up the next meeting. And how that's going to be linked to the notes that are being taken, those automatic AI notes. How do we capture what's in those? So I think it is very interesting when you think about it from a business perspective, is I think a lot is changing, but I think that it's going to allow smaller firms to be able to manage things a lot better because they're going to have this data. Back in the olden days of yore, when I was working in political public relations, um, one of the things my boss made me do was keep file folders when I was communicating with different press outlets. One of my jobs was to like call the press and try and get our stories planted and da 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 da. But she had this, she called it the hit by the bus plan. I like to say abducted by aliens because I feel like it's a little less, gory, but
Dramatic. Yeah.
dramatic. But she was like, if you get hit by a bus, I need to be able to walk onto your desk and pick up the Sacramento Bee folder and know exactly who you've been talking to. I had to take notes every time that I met with somebody. And it was like a pretty great system in the sense that she's like, I just know I can pick it up and take ownership over it. And I think that with more technology in law firms, you're going to see a lot more of that, except it's not going to be a file folder. It's just going to all be at our fingertips. But you're going to have meeting notes and all this data. And if, your attorney is not available, someone else can just pick up that electronic file and jump in. And I think that that's going to be a powerful thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a situation that someone I know who's a public defender was telling me about where she had a lot of clients in jail, and apparently they're supposed to release like the jailhouse like recordings that they have, but they always did it at the very last second, like 2 day or day before they're supposed to be in court. And she's like, this is like hundreds of hours. Like, what are we supposed to do? Poof. Not a problem now,
Right.
like boom, you can just upload those files in like probably minutes. Like you can have an exact transcript if you want the transcript. You can have like comments. You could have bullet points, anything that seems weird and whatever you want.
You could
Basically.
search for vocabulary or names.
Yeah. Or like
like
tell me, exactly. Like tell me like if they were talking about anything that seems weird, whatever. I don't know what's in these tapes. I've never listened to them. But apparently it's usually the sort of thing where like, it's 100 hours and they're like a couple of minutes that are actually really important, but you don't know where those minutes are. So stuff like that, like the needle in a haystack type of stuff, I think is an absolutely perfect, use of an AI.
Yeah. But what I don't think AI is going to replace anytime soon is what it is to be a lawyer interacting with clients and like managing crises, which is basically what lawyers do, generally speaking. Even if you're transactional, it's maybe not like a fire drill type crisis, but there's some sort of big thing happening, right? You don't call a lawyer unless something's either wrong or you're trying to prevent something from going wrong. Those are really your like two scenarios. And I do think that those roles are still going to exist. People will still want advice. I think that it's not like lawyers are going to disappear, but you do need to be willing to be savvy. And I think one of the things that, if you take nothing else from this podcast, is don't be like I was a year ago and just say, this stuff scares me. I don't want to interact with it because you drug me into this, and now I'm like all in. Like I know. I know.
Now you're always like, oh, I found this amazing use case. And I'm like,
know.
oh, great. That's fantastic, Lee. I'm glad you're, really into Claude now.
Exactly.
That's great.
I know. But I do think that you have to somewhat get over your own, mixed feelings about it or this intimidation factor and just start to play with it because it is going to help you in your practice of law. And I'm sure that they're starting to talk about things like this in interviews and things like that. So you don't want to, get an interview question about, using any of these kind of futuristic tools and then saying like, oh, I'm, using any of these kind of futuristic tools.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
like,
and lawyers
oh,
aren't
I'm not
necessarily
really into
known as like the
technology.
biggest technologist of any profession. But I think that, you've got to kind of get up to speed on this. I mean, anyone who's a knowledge worker, which lawyers definitely are, dealing with reading and writing and information, are going to be massively impacted by this. I think that's just the reality. But I do think that what you said earlier about, we still need judgment and humans, and that human relationship piece actually becomes even more critical. So if a client is in a crisis situation and you're like, oh, well, I went to ChatGPT and it told me this, like, that's probably not really going to fly. They need empathy. They need like hand holding. They need you to be supportive, whatever it is that they're hiring you to do, along with like the legal aspect of it. So I think there's still a lot of like human work to be done. And even just learning how to learn and that sort of thing, being self-directed in your learning and learning about tools like this and just being able to use them, creatively. I think it's going to be such a big piece of like adapting to this new world and being successful in it.
Yeah, I know. When people suggest that AI is going to replace all people, I was just in my car and like most people, my car has Siri, right? Siri. I don't like to talk to Siri, but I do like it when Siri reads me text messages while I'm driving.
Yeah,
But
totally.
the new Siri update, it it speaks with much more inflection. And so, like, my husband texted me back and it was like, nice. And I'm like, what? And it wasn't like it was more like, my son was homesick from school and it was more like, he hasn't thrown up. And it was like, nice. And I'm like, that's odd. It felt
You're like,
odd to me in the car. It felt like Siri was overstepping. Its purpose was to just, without too much emotion, read me the text message. Like I wasn't having a conversation with the talking AI. So I do think that there are these things where I'm like, nobody, I'm not calling and having a conversation with this computer. Like, it's just
yeah.
not when I'm in crisis. That is not who I want to talk to. Like we are a ways from that because if the text message reading annoys me, you know.
Yeah, I got a new iPhone and it made me pick like which voice I wanted, but
Oh
they didn't
yeah.
have like the old voice. So they all kind of sounded weird for a while.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I think, things like that, they sound kind of silly, but that's kind of the point is like we're as humans so conscious of like nuances in voice and things like that, that a voice that talks like this is probably not going to be something that people want to listen to for legal advice, Like,
Or a voice that when you say like, well, this really horrible thing happened, and it's like, nice. Like nobody wants to
oh
hear that.
no.
Oh no.
See? You're like, what? That's just,
I
it's
know.
off. It's
It's off.
off.
It's off. We're a ways away from that. I'm just saying. I mean, and I take the self-driving Waymo cars in San Francisco. I'm fine with that, but it's the communication stuff where I'm like, I can't. I will literally let the computer drive me around, but I really don't want to talk to it.
That's fair.
That's fair.
Yeah, and I think that, I think that does bring up this question of like, what should people be doing in law school? And I think some of it is, paying attention to this, maybe taking classes in it, whatnot, but also like really developing those people skills and your emotional intelligence and things like that. I think are so important and probably even more important going forward.
Yeah. I also think, as you mentioned earlier, like you have to be good at learning because I think that the changes in technology and the ways that we move within the world are at lightning speed. I mean, much faster than it was for our parents, much faster than it was even when we were began practicing law. I mean, it's funny. I find myself being like, how many years have we had an iPhone? Like there was a time before the iPhone, but I mean, when that came out, like we all had Blackberries, I mean, it was like a lot of stuff has changed, but it's changing much faster. And so to be able to be nimble, I think is something that you really want to take to heart. And that means that you have to not be afraid of learning new things, try out these tools, try and at least understand what's happening in the landscape so you can dive in and learn them, because a lot of people maybe at your big law firm are ready to do that.
Yeah. No, and I think that is kind of a through line I found throughout legal education and legal practice and doing what we do now is most lawyers actually like to learn things. So
Hmm.
I think people are pretty well situated. I mean, they're not always, into science and math and technology and that kind of thing, but like we are good at learning things. That's what
Hmm.
lawyers do. If you're working on a case, it was always this situation of like, okay, now you need to get up to speed on this whole universe that you knew nothing about yesterday. And we need you to be an expert within the most short period of time possible.
Hmm.
And so I think that is actually something that people are good at. And I would lean into that.
Yeah, I remember going to one of my first meetings about the first trial team that I was placed on. And I'm sitting in this like office, and the senior associate turns to me and he says, so this is about welding rods. Do you know what that is? And I'm like, no. And he's like, okay, well, I mean, I'll tell you like 2 minutes, but you should go figure out what that is. And then, and so then I'm back at my desk being like, what is a welding rod?
Right.
Like,
Totally.
and then I spent like a decent chunk of time like trying to understand it so I could go do the legal work associated with it. Because that's like part of what it is. You have to figure out what you're talking about because it can come at you in tons of different contexts.
Yeah, I remember when I was at trial on like a hardware case, and another associate who was a friend of mine came out of court one day and he's like, I finally think I understand electricity. Like our expert was like Mr. Wizard out there. And Because he,
Yeah.
we had to figure out how to present to a jury that had no one who'd finished college this very complicated case about, I don't remember what exactly it was, but it had to do with, I think it was voltage regulators. And to understand a voltage regulator, you have to understand how electricity works, so we had to find and train this expert, not train, but, coach this expert who was some insane, PhD, multi-PhD guy, how to convey this to a jury. And that, it was very interesting, but that stuff's not easy.
Now, I watched a patent trial on dialysis machines, and what they were fighting over was um the screen and the touch pad or whatever of the dialysis machine. And it was weeks of discussing that. And I remember sitting in that place going, I don't know that I follow this. So I'm pretty sure that
Yeah.
the jury is not following this because taking, really complicated concepts and making them simple is very, very hard to do. But I think that is something that AI can help you
I
with.
was going to say, who might be good at that?
Yes.
Our new friend
Our new
Claude, I
friend
bet,
Claude.
could take, this very complicated concept and kind of, distill it down
Mhm.
so that someone at maybe a seventh grade level could understand it. That sort of thing would actually be really useful.
Yeah. I think one of the things when you start messing with these tools that I have learned is you have to be very specific about what you wanted to do. So in that case, I think the mistakes I made in my early Claude use where I was not giving it enough direction. It really wants to know like I want you to do this and I want it to be written so someone with a 7th grade reading level can understand it. I want it
Right.
to be in this tone. This is the audience. This is the purpose of it. And the more prompting you give it, um, the better. I think the other thing law students need to consider is what are the ethical ramifications of this? When can you use it, in a trial? When can you use it in generating things for clients? I did I've been doing my CLE because it's my time to turn in all my CLE. And I did do a CLE on kind of how to copyright work that may have been influenced by AI, which was actually like a fairly interesting CLE. So thanks for
Yeah.
the people who put that together. But these are things we haven't really thought about, And
Right.
so if you're not taking copyright classes, you may not be talking about that. And if you're not talking about it, maybe in your ethics classes, you should ask the professors and say, like, this is coming up for us. Who's talking about this? Who's writing about it? Or write a paper on it. I
I
think
was going
you
to say,
can, yeah.
great law review note
Oh, like
topics.
great law review note topic. Yeah, right for discussion, right? And it's a wild, wild west out there, right? We don't have a lot of precedent for what to do with all this technology. So
Yeah.
it's a cutting edge time. Um, but you do want to make sure that you are participating and not opting out.
Yeah, and I think writing a note or a paper on some of this would just be such a great way to kind of dive into the material,
Mhm.
get familiar with it, use it. I mean, who's not going to ask you about that if that's on your resume?
Oh, totally. Just especially like a law firm partner who might be in their 60s, who's like,
Yeah.
I don't even know what some of this stuff really is unless they practice law in this area.
Yeah, I think that would actually be a really great option for
Mhm.
people because everybody is going to want to talk about that. And if you can talk about that in a meaningful, understandable type of way, I think that might actually give you a really big leg up in the job market.
Oh, yeah. And then you could take that note and feed it to Claude and ask it for some great LinkedIn posts about it. Like, oh, yes. Quoting directly from your own piece, using as much language that comes out of your own piece. So it is just pulling your own language. Oh, very powerful
Uh,
stuff. See,
yeah.
now everybody has their note topic. You're welcome.
Or at least an idea for
That's right.
notes. And, you can go generate some of those and brainstorm. But yeah, I think, something like that. I mean, even now we're actually getting excited about that because it's something we hadn't thought about probably until that exact moment. But you can
Yeah.
take that and run with it. And I think it would be really useful.
Yeah. So I know we're almost out of time, but I hope that what folks can get from this is that although some of this AI stuff can be scary and some of the headlines around it are really intimidating that you will see in the news. And, when they start talking about how it's going to take over the world and that like we have a while until the computers take over the world, and that may be true, but that's a very hopefully far away time. I think that the things that happen, I try not to think about that stuff, but I will say that sometimes when you read those things, it can feel like, oh, well, I shouldn't be interacting with it at all. And I just think that that's not a practical way to approach the new frontier that is AI and technology in the legal profession. I think you want to participate and just make sure that you're ready to pivot and learn new things because they're coming for you. New things are coming for you.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think that the more you can kind of get in there and play with it, the better off you're probably going to be.
Yeah. Well, I would like to take us one last second before we wrap up and just thank everybody for listening to 500 episodes of us.
I don't think I remember reminiscing earlier today in my head. I think we had the idea for this podcast like in a bar with a friend of hers who had an LSAT podcast. I remember for some reason, I don't know why we were day drinking with this person, but for some reason we were all day
trying
drinking.
to record a podcast about it, I think.
That's right. Maybe that was the thing. Yeah, but I just remember I was like, why were we into the bar like 2 p.m? But he was like, you guys should really start a podcast. And, we took it and ran with it. And here we are 500 episodes later.
And millions of downloads. I mean,
yeah,
millions
literally.
upon millions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you all for listening. It has been a great ride. We love hearing from folks that they listen to it. It's pretty cool. So
yeah,
thanks for sharing your time with us. We're glad you find it to be helpful. And I hope that we're going to continue talking about the future of AI and technology. And as I learn more exciting things from my friend Claude, who sometimes I thank, which is also weird. I was like, I shouldn't have to thank the AI, but I think it's fun to talk about. So I'm sure we'll keep talking about it.
I agree. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please take a second and give us a like or leave a comment. And you can be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss anything else. And if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, feel free to reach out to us via the contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com.
If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to give us a like and leave a comment. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future content. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com.